I couldn't do that 50 years.
I was talking, speaking of magic, I was talking to the kids about miracles earlier today, and trying to get them to understand that there are miracles constantly around us that we just totally are oblivious to.
We gave that sermon about almost a year ago.
Do you remember which examples I used?
You used Elijah golden chariot.
Mhm.
Was that the same sermon?
Nope, this was a different one. This one I was actually bringing them the quote from Moreh Nevuchim, from Guide for the Perplexed. What?
Was it the guillotine?
Nope. This was the one about the birth, about babies. He said if you tell somebody that there is an angel that is made of fire and its size is a third of the universe, and it comes and it puts the life into the mother's womb, people will think this is glorious and praise God, this is amazing, it's a miracle. But if you tell them instead that there's the seed that is implanted in the womb and that it unfolds according to law, the natural law of that God created, people do not consider that to be amazing or miraculous. And he said the second one is much more miraculous than the first, because the first is nonsense. He's a little bit less blunt, but the idea that an angel that's made of fire can enter into a person without harming them, he says, what are you crazy? Right? It doesn't work like that, but people want to believe in the flash. In fact, in the handout for today's class, we did a little bit from Kings with Naaman, who came from Aram to be cured of his sarad, of his leprosy. And he got really angry when he was told, just go wash in the Jordan. And he's like, I expected him to wave his hands over the, I'm expecting magic. And you don't get magic. That's not what God does. So yeah, but what we do have is halakha, and we are on chapter 7. Let's see if we can get some more Mishnah down. We're getting into the home stretch here. We only got 7 and 8 to go. It's not a page number, but what you'll find at the top is it'll say Eduyot, that's the name of the Masechet, the book, and it'll say 7:1.
Do you already think about our next one?
I haven't figured out yet. I mean, something a little more topical to tie people together. I was considering Sota because we haven't really done any Nashim. We could also do instead Ketubot or Gittin for marriage or divorce.
We got Perk vote yet?
We did Perkei Avot a few years ago, yeah. Not recently, but quite some time ago. But I think I'd like to do something from Seder Nashim, from that section, because we haven't really touched on it yet. So yeah, we'll see. But if there are recommendations or requests, I am always happy to listen to them. All right, so Eduyot 7:1. We're going to get another collection, again, by rabbis who are giving us different teachings, and we'll unpack each of them as they go along. We don't have our designated reader, so we will go around the table. You are welcome to say pass, and we'll simply move on to the next person. No one should feel pressured. And as is my usual style, I'll begin over here, if you don't mind.
Not at all. Mishnah 1.
Mishnah 1.
Rabbi Joshua and Rabbi Tzadok testified concerning the redemption of the firstborn donkey, that if it died, the priest receives nothing.
Okay, so let's talk about the issue here. So the first issue is, this comes from the book of Shemot, right, of Exodus, where the firstborn of any animal has to be redeemed, or has to be sacrificed. But if it's a non-kosher animal, then you can't sacrifice a donkey on the altar of Jerusalem, or any altar of Jewish law for that matter. And therefore you have to substitute, you have to redeem it with another animal, which is what's included here in the parentheses, a lamb. So everybody got that basic model? My donkey's had a baby, the baby can't go on the altar, so I dedicate a lamb instead of that donkey, and now the lamb is going to go for the altar. The question comes up, what happens if something happens to the lamb? Right? Because that is dedicated to God. That's dedicated to the altar. That's going to go to the Kohanim. So if the lamb's gone, do I need a replacement, or do I not need a replacement? That's the underlying question. Yes?
Wait, so lamb is like sheep, right?
Yeah, a lamb is like a young sheep. And also very tasty.
I had a quick question.
Yeah.
How come with the firstborn of a human, it's money then not a lamb, though, or the equivalent of?
Well, we're actually going to talk about that in just a second, but partly that's because you can't kill people.
Right, but I thought you had to give like money to redeem.
We do. It's what's known as pidyon haben, the redemption of the child, and it also is for the firstborn. Some complicated laws of what classifies as firstborn, But yes, there is a redemption that happens with coinage, which we're going to talk about actually in part 2. That's going to be used as one of the proof texts for trying to answer this question. So why don't we go ahead and work this out. So Rabbi Eliezer is going to give his opinion first.
Whereas Rabbi Eliezer says the owner must bear the responsibility as with the 5 selas in the case of the firstborn son.
All right. So Rabbi Joshua and Rabbi Tzadok said that if the if the lamb dies, the lamb dies. And sorry, no one has to make any replacement. You don't need a makeup lamb to cover the lamb that you had dedicated as a makeup for the donkey. But Rabbi Eliezer says, absolutely you do. The same way that if you were doing the redemption of a firstborn son, and you've got your 5 coins, and on your way to the ceremony with the Kohen, somebody knocks you in the back of the head, they take the money from you, you've got to get 5 more coins to take them to the Kohen. You can't just say, well, sorry, you need to provide the additional coins. But the sages, on the other hand,
But the sages say he bears no responsibility any more than in the case of the redemption of the second tithes.
all right, so again, the second tithe were things that were meant to be eaten in Jerusalem. We've talked about this before. Sometimes, however, Jerusalem would be too far or the amount of vegetables would be too much. And so you'd convert it to cash because that's a lot easier to carry. The question becomes, if I've converted my tithe to cash and I bring it to Jerusalem and along the way I get mugged or it falls out of my pocket or whatever, do I need to get more money to replace the money that had been the redemption of the tithe to then spend and use in Jerusalem? And the answer there is no. So what's the difference between the tithe money and the baby money? And the tithe money being the parallel to the donkey lamb, the lamb in place of the donkey. So what the argument here is basically is whether or not what you have dedicated attains a special status or not. In the case of the 5 coins that you use for the Pinyon Haben, for the redemption of a child, they do not retain special status until they are actually presented to the Kohen. So if they are taken, lost, destroyed, or somehow removed from the ceremony, then new ones need to be provided because there has been no special status attached to them until they have been handed over. On the other hand, if we are talking about the lamb that's been dedicated or the money that's been redeemed from the produce that was going to go, that is a one-to-one connection to the thing that is not going to be brought to Jerusalem, and therefore it and only it can do the job. And if it and only it is lost, there's no way to make up for it. That's the underlying argument that's happening here, and the logic of why we conclude to say no makeup lambs, right? Because that lamb was irreplaceable. It was perfectly linked to the donkey that wasn't going to the altar. Therefore, you can't do another. And even though you might say, but yeah, but I still have the donkey, doesn't matter. That lamb, that was the only thing that was linked to it, and nothing else can replace it.
My understanding is the coins on the second tithe you were to consume yourself, but the lamb was to be consumed by the Kohanim, right?
Correct.
Oh, so I mean, if you lose your own coins, then you just lost your own consumption. But if you lose the lamb, then you lose the Kohanim's consumption, right?
Yeah.
All right. So how come they may say they're similar then?
Because it doesn't. It's not a question of who actually is going to consume it. It's a question of can it be replaced? Can it be reduplicated? It's not telling us that we don't need to duplicate our money because it's just you and we don't worry about you. If it was required, you would have to do it even if you didn't feel like doing it. Jewish law often makes us do things that we don't feel like doing. So it's not about who's benefiting from it. It's simply about the irreplaceability of whatever it is that's being dedicated. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. Should we move on to 7.2? Okay, 7.2. I think, Aaron, we're up to you for reading.
Rabbi Zadok testified concerning brine of unclean locusts that it is clean.
Okay, everybody ready? Have you guys all had dinner yet?
Yeah.
Okay, so first of all, you hopefully understand and are aware that there are species of locusts that are kosher, right? Locusts are like grasshoppers, and some of them are kosher. Most species are not. There is some debate about which are and which aren't. Nowadays, most Jews do not eat locusts, but there are still some, especially from Yemen, that do have it as part of their custom to eat the kosher varieties. That's all good. Everyone's good, right? Because now we're going to take it one level grosser. So there are species that are kosher, and there are species that are not kosher. If I've got a barrel full of non-kosher locusts, all dead and soaking in preservative, in like salt water, presumably some of their juices are leaking out into the vat. Does that juice, does that brine count as kosher or not kosher? Your gut is probably saying, I don't want to eat it, and probably saying not kosher, right? Rabbi Tzadok is saying, absolutely it is, right? That drippings, if you will, is okay. You look disgusted.
No, because it's also something impure. It's with our body, because they're completely dead and even are not in a good shape. And not recently also neither.
Okay, well, so first of all,
so that's why
let's talk about kosher locusts. If I have a locust and it's sitting there on my bush, right? What do I need to do to prepare it to eat? I mean, if I catch a deer, right, I have to do a shechita. I have to slaughter the deer. I have to drain the blood and get the blood out of the meat and remove all the things I have to do for. What do I have to do for a locust? Nothing.
But
even if it's alive.
But at the moment it's fresh. In this case,
doesn't matter.
It's not fresh.
Doesn't matter, right? The technical term that's used in the halacha is their gathering is their shechita, right? That when you gather them, you are slaughtering them. By the way, that's the same halacha for fish, which means that if you have like a fish and you scoop it up out of the water and you go, and it's wiggling in your mouth and you're, that's kosher. That's perfectly kosher. And if you have a fish that you scoop out of the water and you hang up to dry and it sits there for 6 months and becomes a little fish jerky, that's also kosher. You don't have to do anything to make it more kosher. It's once you've caught it, once you've gathered it, it's already fine to go. And again, yeah, the idea of eating live locusts is pretty upsetting, but it is technically kosher, which is one more proof that keeping kosher is not necessarily going to keep you from being gross. I should point out, as a little aside, there was a discussion in the Shulchan Aruch between Joseph Caro, the Sephardic rabbi, and the Ramah, the Ashkenazic rabbi, where the Ramah added on, but we don't do this because it's disgusting.
But like the brine comes from an unkosher animal.
That's the question, is the brine of dead locusts sitting in their own preservative. If it was a kosher species, everyone knows that that's perfectly fine, as much as my stomach disagrees. The real chiddush here is, what about this? And so the underlying issue is what counts as a transmitter of uncleanliness, right? And locust juice doesn't count as a transmitter. We've talked before, and the list is in the handout as well under the footnote for section 1, right? Dew, water, wine, oil, blood, milk, and bees' honey, right? These are all things that once they've come into contact, these liquids, with an object, it now is receptive to ritual impurity. This ain't one of those. Therefore, we're not concerned with it. Again, not the way we normally. Now, if this seems a little confusing, this is actually the clearer version, or the stronger version, because part 2 of our Mishnah is going to tell us what another formulation of it was. So go ahead and read part 2.
Where the first Mishnah said, unclean locusts that have been preserved together with clean locusts do not make their brine unfit.
Okay, so the first version, the first Mishnah, what this is talking about here is the idea that it used to be taught the following way, but Rabbi Tzadok came along and he taught it in a way that made all of the implications clearer. Because you can imagine that if you only had the Mishnah in the second half, that you might think that having stuffed all the locusts together, I'm allowed to pull out the kosher locusts, and that would be okay. But what he's arguing is that, yes, it's okay because the brine of the non-kosher locusts is also okay. So he's emphasizing one element, which
it's not kosher. The brine is kosher. Why is okay?
Because it's not a non-kosher substance. Even though it comes from a non-kosher contact of a non-kosher animal, it's not a non-kosher substance in and of itself. So it's still technically okay. It'd be like, the sweat of a dog. Dogs don't sweat. The sweat of a horse, right? Is the sweat of a horse kosher or not kosher?
Kosher, because the horse is kosher.
It would
It
be,
is.
Horse is not kosher.
it has hooves.
It does not have split hooves, and it does not chew its cud, right? So no horse meat for us. But horses are in wide use throughout ancient Israel, as well as through most of our Jewish history. And people would often be riding horses, and their hands would often, be touching the horse while it sweat and all of that. And no one was being especially fastidious that the sweat of the horse did not come into contact. Now, the blood of the horse, of course, you kept the blood of the horse away, but the sweat of the horse was not an issue. Now, you shouldn't go around collecting it deliberately and using it. If you want to see what that looks like, see A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum, which is a very funny movie from the 1960s. I'm not sure if you're old enough for that yet.
What's the movie called?
What?
What's the movie called?
A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum. Has a comedian in it by the name of Zero Mostel. It also has, what was the guy's name? He eventually sang in Phantom of the Opera. I can't remember the lead.
Was he the lead of the Phantom of the Opera?
Yes, of the original.
That.
Yeah, he was the lead, and he plays this scrawny little Roman, and it's very funny. Anyway, they have a whole joke about horse sweat in that particular movie. So the issue here is that is not technically, but also this is not technically. What is even more fascinating with this particular Mishnah is that it reminds us of the idea that the Mishnah is not repeated verbatim from one teacher to the next. That the Mishnah is a set of wisdom and knowledge that is formulated as needed when one teacher is giving it to the new student. And that means there's always going to be an adaptation. I know that you've done a lot of teaching, so I can point to you if you don't mind and say, if you teach the algebra to someone, do you recite your explanation of algebra like a script, right? No.
And you change every period.
Every period, exactly. And maybe even from the beginning of one period to the end of the period, you've already used 3 different ways of explaining it, depending upon whether the eyes are lighting up or whether they're asleep. And that is what a good teacher does, is constantly change it. But do you change what algebra is? No, right? The algebra is what algebra is, but how I teach it to a student will often need to adapt and change and be living and flexible. This is showing us that same thing happens with Mishnah. Whatever it was that God conveyed directly to Moshe was not repeated verbatim to Joshua, right? And whatever Joshua heard from Moshe was not repeated verbatim to the elders, right? It wasn't like they were passing down a script. This is why it was the oral Torah, not the written Torah. The written Torah is a script in the sense that it is fixed words, unchanging, absolutely immovable. The Mishnah had fixed content, fixed meaning, but the wrapper, the words, were constantly changing as long as it didn't interfere with the meaning, the explanation. Now, when you have a living teacher in your room and the teacher's explaining something and they see that the eyes are not clicking, the teacher can adapt, can change, can give more examples and all of that. That's why. What's that? Exactly. That's the great thing about having a living teacher. Where the Mishnah had trouble and why it took so long before they finally decided to write it down was once you write it down, you've only got one version. And now what happens when you have a student who doesn't understand it, which is why the Mishnah was still, even after it was written, not meant to be studied without a teacher. The Mishnah was still there more like a shorthand lesson plan rather than a substitute for studying with a teacher. It was the notes you were supposed to refer to after you'd already learned it, but this way you could remember it more easily.
But nothing in Judaism is meant to be studied by yourself. Always you need at least an Ha'ura.
Always, yes.
Or someone to exchange opinion,
and to tell you when you're wrong.
Yeah.
Exactly right.
To challenge each other's perspective.
And that is one of the glories of Judaism, in my opinion, is that we have always had that give and take of discussion, and everybody's been told you don't get to just do it by yourself. If you do it by yourself, you're going to get it wrong. Do it with more people, you'll probably get closer and closer to the truth. And that's what the Mishnah is trying to do. But what we have here is a little glimpse into the idea of two different ways of teaching it. By the way, this is what you see a lot more of in the Talmud. When you're studying the Talmud, it'll bring the Mishnah, and then other rabbis, as they're trying to unpack the Talmud teaching, will also bring what are known as Braitot. Braitot are non-Mishnaic teachings from the same time period as the Mishnah. So we have one version of how the rabbis explain something, and then we will bring other versions of how other rabbis explained the same or at least similar topics, and then try to use that to triangulate in on a fuller understanding. So that the Talmud spends a lot of time trying to say we have the Mishnah, but we have another teaching. Are they compatible or are they not compatible? And that's much of the debate.
But the other hand, the other hand is the Mishnah. In the case of Mishnah against Brita is Mishnah.
Mishnah wins, right? Mishnah is considered authoritative, but how to interpret Mishnah is up to the rabbis of the Talmud, and they will often rely on the Braitot. But however, what they will often do, which is always so much fun to watch new students encounter this, is they'll say, well, I know that Rabbi so-and-so is said to have taught this, but that can't be right, so let me change his word order. And it's like, whoa, you're changing the word? Well, yeah, because otherwise it doesn't make sense. And the rabbis were willing to do that when necessary.
How come horse sweat doesn't count as water?
Because it's not.
It's not?
Yeah, how come blood doesn't count as water?
But I thought it was H2O.
Yeah, I'm sure that it is a large portion of it is H2O, as is your blood, as is most liquids. But that doesn't mean that it has the legal status of H2O. I make you bet that if you were to take a bottle of tequila and measure its content, most of it's water. And yet, if you drink a whole lot of tequila and get into a car, legally you're going to have problems that you wouldn't have if you drank the same amount of water.
But it's the non-H2O stuff that's the problem.
I wasn't drinking much, officer. In fact, 99% of what I drank was just water. It was the 1% also, and then so yeah, it's a legal definition, not a chemical definition,
right?
And that makes all the difference. Okay, all right, 7:3. Are you up for reading?
Sure.
We begin where it says, in the middle where it says Mishnah 3. The introduction you can read on your own, but out loud we just do the actual Mishnah.
Rabbi Tzadok testified concerning flowing water which exceeded in quantity dripping water, that it was valid.
Okay, what in the world are we talking about? Dripping water, flowing water? We're talking about a mikvah, which is why I've got my blue pen all ready to go.
Oh yeah, how can you contain like a whole pool, like, or just rainwater? Do you just...
Well, so there's a couple different ways to do it. So let's talk about the ideal man-made mikvah, right? So obviously oceans and big lakes, everybody agrees those are mikvah. Oh, that's perfectly fine. But if you've got not an ocean and not a lake, you've got a couple options. Now, in the ideal man-made setting, for example, go to Ohev Shalom, and they have a beautiful mikvah there you can see. You have 40 seah, I don't know how you do it in English, of water, right? You have to have a certain minimum quantity of water that is what we call mayim chayim, natural living water. Rainwater is one way to do it. Glacial melt is another way to do it. That's how we do it in Southern California, because you don't get a whole lot of rainwater. Florida, not such an issue. Plenty of rainwater. But that's if you've got a nice big basin that you can do it. And that's considered to be the amount of water necessary to cover a full person, right? It's like if you were to draw a rectangle around a person, and then fill it with water, it would come out. It would minimum. This is minimum. Yeah. What?
To stand up.
A prism. Thank you, Mr. Geometry. Yes, a prism. Exactly.
To stand up or lay down.
You just have to be immersed, and that's kind of where we're going to get into a question here, which is.
Standing up and assuming the water will kind of like want to levitate you up.
Well, always you're going to be buoyant in water, more or less, depending upon your body composition and the salinity of the water. But the question is, usually in a mikvah, most of the modern mikvahot we have, it's easy to walk down and sort of crouch and float, and then you just walk out. But you could come in different shapes of a prism, because any good geometry teacher will tell you the same amount of volume could be covered by different surface area, by the different arrangement of the sides. right? You can have a cube one, you can have long, thin ones, you can have tall ones, and you can still end up with 40 seah or more. So that's sort of a classic example of a man-made mikveh. What Rabbi Tzadok here is describing is the question of what happens if you've got a non-perfect man-made mikveh, or indeed even perhaps a natural mikveh, which is to say, you've got a bit of a river, right? But this is a slight variation, right? We've talked about the river and the mountain runoff and all of that. So I've got a bit of a river, but it's also got water pouring down. So you have the river plus the fall equals 40 plus, right? So if the combined amount of water is 40 seot, you're standing in the river with the shower on top of you of water. And again, this is all natural water, not plumbing shower. What counts? And what is his argument? His argument that is if the flowing, that's the river, right, is greater than the fall, you're okay, right? As long as the majority plus is the natural flowing water, then if there's a little extra coming in from the fall, that's okay. Does that make sense? That is, so he's saying you can combine the two, but the dominant form has to be the flowing river rather than the water that's pouring down. So you can't just go and stand under a waterfall and say, I'm in a mikveh. But if the mikveh comes up to your chest and there's a waterfall that's dousing you from the top, and between what's below the water and coming down is more than 40, then according to Rabbi Tzadok, you'd be okay.
So you can convert in like Niagara Falls.
I think you'd die, because I think if you stood under Niagara Falls, it would kill you. The amount of water falling would be too much weight.
More than 40.
But it would certainly be kosher before you die. So yes, it'd be awfully hard to do the brachot though, because you couldn't hear the person. It would be too loud. But yes, you could combine with a waterfall, is what Rabbi Tzadok is saying here, is that the flowing and the dripping could be sufficient. Make sense? Okay, and now we're going to get a little proof for this. So if you could read part 2.
There was such case at the Birat Hapilia, and when the case came before the sages, they declared it valid.
Right. So we get a little proof text, which is nice theory, but has this ever happened? And he says, yes, there was a case where this is exactly what happened, and it came before the Beit Din of the Chachamim, the sages, meaning the larger number of sages, not just him, and they said it's okay. So therefore, we have validation. Good. Okay. Moving on from the mikveh. 7.4.
I have a question.
Yes.
Back. How is one person can testify to what a whole court said?
As long as no one contradicts them.
I was going to say, because we ran into that problem, I think, back in, what's his name, and he got exiled. That's communicated.
No. That's, so he didn't, if you're talking about Rabbi Eliezer, he didn't contradict.
Not Eliezer, the guy they said, retract and we'll make you.
Oh.
I know that he contradicted everyone else, though.
Right. He wasn't saying the court before me taught this and no one complained. He was saying, this is what my teachers taught me. Right. So he was of the opinion that this was his memory. They were of the opinion that it was a different memory. Right. They argued about what the ruling was. So what we have here is not about whether someone else ever held your opinion. What they're arguing about here, not arguing, what they're stating here is that there is a history, there was a record, there was a precedent that this law was put into practice, was put to the test, and the sages allowed it. Now, if someone else came and said, no, they didn't, then we'd be right back where we started. Because, if one person says they allowed it, another person says they didn't allow it, then we have to continue the argument. We have to go, the discussion progresses.
And what's his name got in trouble because when the other courts ruled against him, he failed to accept their ruling, right?
So the other, what's his name? Rabbi Eliezer, right?
No, the guy who was excommunicated.
No, remember, they didn't. So the Mishnah said that he was excommunicated, but then they backtracked and said, no, not him. It was the other guy who had the problem with netilat yadayim, with the hand
And
washing,
they throw him all the stones
on his grave.
Yeah.
Yeah. when he was being buried. So, and that was again because his rejection wasn't a point of law. His rejection was of, can the rabbis even make that decision? And that's rabbinical authority. And once you start attacking that, then you're no longer playing the game. It's like everybody said, all right, let's play football. And some guy shows up with his bat and says, no, we need to play baseball. It's like, off the field, right? We agreed, it's football. You're not allowed to come play baseball.
So he rejected the authority of the court and the whole authority of the court, or just the ruling on that one thing?
Well, by objecting the ruling on that thing, he objected to the entire idea of rabbinic authority, right? Or at least that was the implication, especially when he refused to retract. Okay. Okay, so we're on 7-4. Natan, if you would be so kind.
Rabbi Tzadok testified that flowing waters, which he channeled, is not foliage, are feet.
Okay, so what's happening here? So we know that we've got our ideal mikvah, right? Our 40 sayas inside a nice cistern, and it happened to come in all by natural means, right? Rainwater, glacial melt, whatever you need. But what happens if I use a faucet, right? If I've got my mikvah and I take the hose from the wall and I just walk over, put the hose in it, and I turn on the hose, is it a kosher mikvah or not?
No.
That's not naturally flowing water. That's not allowed. So what his question here is, all right, so I know I can't use pipes, and I know I can't use like buckets of water that I'm dumping in. So what about if instead there's a river over here and I line up some leaves so that the river gets siphoned into the mikveh, right? But I'm just laying down like, imagine like big palm leaves, so they're kind of scoopy shaped, and the water will go through them, and I can point them in the right direction to fill up my mikveh.
The question is the water will be unliving water. It will continue running all the time.
Right. So are these leaves, let me change the color so it's a little clearer, right? Are these leaves, is that a pipe? That's the question. And he says, no, they're not a pipe. That's just like if I had a river and I dug a trench with a stick, it's still a river, right? Rivers dig trenches, and I can dig an irrigation trench and it's still part of the river.
So canal are okay.
A canal is fine. Everybody agrees a canal is fine, right? Like in down like in Winter Park, when you take a little boat tour, right? You go through little tiny canals between one section to the other. If you were to jump off the boat and use that as a mikveh right there in the canal, you're fine. Right? Don't do it. There were alligators. But
So what if it's a half pipeline?
So that's the question. Once it becomes a man-made like structure, right? Once you've actually got it into your deliberate canal rather than just guiding it, then that's where it trips, and that trips over the line. And his argument or his question that he answers is, do the little leaves count as being sufficiently manipulated by humanity that it's no longer natural water? And the answer is the leaves are not a problem. The leaves work. Now, this is something that we've bumped into so many times. The idea of when does something that is natural become something that is man-made? Again, it's a great reminder that the world as a whole, the natural state of the world is tahor, right? The natural state of the world is ritually pure. And the idea of the mayim chayim in general as being naturally replenishing the fact that it is ritually pure. And therefore, that's what we use for a mikveh. And that's why you could take a dead body, squish it around in the mikveh, take the dead body out, and the mikveh is still kosher, right? You're a jerk for doing that, but the mikveh is still technically kosher. And if you have any question of that, just think of how many people have ever been buried at sea in the ocean. I mean, not even on purpose, just ship sink. Right? If those bodies defiled the mikveh, then the entire ocean would be off limits. But the ocean is fine. And that's, again, the natural state of the world. The natural flowing waters are considered to constantly be replenishing themselves to a state of purity. And the mikvah system that the rabbis talk about does exactly that same thing until you tamper with it. is once you take the water out of the system, right? Once you detach it from its system and move it through our process, then I don't know whether anything has contaminated it and not been replenished by being, put into that natural system again. I should point out, however, that it's kind of off topic. So let's say you've got a mikveh and the mikveh walls are huge, right? And so you've got like steps like this coming down. Those are meant to be steps. Steps coming down. They even took a drafting class in high school.
And that's what happened in the mikveh. In a mikveh in Ohev Shalom, it's like that.
Right, but let's imagine you've got a mikveh like this, but the steps are like 30 feet down, right? And you don't want to have to walk all the way down to the bottom of the mikveh.
You swim, like you die.
Nope, you turn on the pipe. Once the mikveh is kosher, once the mikveh has reached 40 seot, it's actually filled to enough, the minimum, then you can add man-made water and you're fine. I mean, man-processed water. And so that's what you do to make sure it fills up. And by the way, also what you do for a mikveh to work against evaporation, right? Because a little bit of that water was leaving every day. And if you had to rely entirely on natural flowing water into the mikveh to keep it fresh, it just is impossible. So instead, once it's kosher, it will always be kosher as long as you keep the more water coming into it, even if the new water you're adding is man-made, because as it goes into the mikveh, it's made pure because it's going into a mikveh. So the mikveh has the power to purify anything that comes into it, including the non-mayim chayim, the non-living waters. So that's where we can keep a mikveh going in perpetuity. Following that? Good. All right, and we're going to get another case study.
A case occurred in Aliyah, and it came before the chamber of hewn stone, and they permitted it.
Right, so the chamber of the hewn stone is a constant, comes up frequently in the Mishnah and other places. It's one of the parts of the temple, and it was one of the places where they would often do decisions.
I was expecting the case. Where is the case?
No, the cases of the leaves.
Yeah, but
So again, just like we had in the last Mishnah, he makes a statement, and then they say, yeah, and that actually happened. And they said it was okay. So rabbinic seal of approval.
Why do they bring out that there's a case in this one and the last one? Are they just wondering if is this an advisory opinion?
Stylistic, right? So you have two teachings of Rabbi Tzadok that both have this A-B structure. A is the rule and B is a proof because of precedent. And you put them together because it makes it easier for the student to remember.
So it has nothing to do with whether or not these are hypothetical rules.
No, it's just an easier way for the student to remember the implication of the teaching. I know, it's almost like the teachers of the Mishnah wanted us to be able to remember. Who would have thought?
So
7.
I'm wondering how the fact that it actually happened makes it easier to remember.
It's not, but the teaching that he had included the anecdote. And since there were two teachings of his that both happened to be mikvah related that included an anecdote, putting them back to back makes it easier for the student who's trying to remember all of these different bits of testimony. I know, because most of us, I'm sure, I would hesitate to say this, but I think, are not going home and repeating this 100 times for each Mishnah so that we can memorize it, so that if you didn't have your Mishnah with you, you could simply spout precisely the original wording. But that's exactly what happened in the ancient world, because most of us did not have photocopiers that could just print out new copies of the Mishnah whenever we felt like. And so you would memorize the Mishnah, and it was organized in a way they felt was helpful for memorization. We may disagree, but that may be because we're not expert memorizers. Most people in the ancient world were, because they had to be, because even if they were literate, they didn't have cheap paper floating around for them to constantly write things down on.
They had papyrus.
Even papyrus was rare. It's as I'm gonna say, it's rare. It's rare because it's expensive, and it's expensive because it's rare. Making cheap paper is something that's very modern, and even then, making cheap paper that kind of lasts is very modern, because you didn't want to spend your time on cheap paper if it had to be done by hand, and you were paying some guy to write the book for you. If it was on cheap paper, it would fall apart, a few years later, and you wasted your money. So until we got the printing press, we didn't really need cheap paper because everything was done by hand prior to that. So the two had to come together. So we are spoiled, he says, as we sit in a room full of books. Make sense? Okay, 7.5. More purity issues.
Okay. Rabbi Joshua and Rabbi Yakima, a man of Hadar, testified concerning a jar of ashes of a red heifer, which was put over a creeping thing. They were unclean. Sorry, a creeping thing. But they were unclean. Whereas Rabbi Eliezer had pronounced them clean.
Okay, so I need to erase because we're on a totally different topic. So the red heifer, right? Para aduma. This is from Parashat Chukat, where if somebody comes into contact with a corpse, which is like mega ritual impurity, then after having waited for 7 days for the ritual impurity from the initial contact, they are sprinkled with water that has been mixed with the ash from the burnt up body of this red cow, right? And if you don't understand that, that's okay. Neither did King Solomon. But that's what Parashat Chukat says is how we take care of the impurity of coming in contact with the deceased, which again, as a reminder, means that we are all ritually impure.
So if you're like in this battlefield and you're like a paramedic and you see a dead body, you are unclean.
Not if you see it, if you touch it. Now, if you're in a building and there's a dead body and you're underneath the same roof, then yes, you are ritually unclean, right? Or let's take a more likely scenario. Let's imagine that, a person is at home and they're there with their grandparent and the grandparent dies while they're holding their hand. You're now ritually impure, right? Which is not a problem, right? Ritual impurity is not a sin. Ritual impurity is a normal part of life. It's going to happen. In fact, for women, it's going to happen to a lesser degree than the death contact. It's going to happen monthly, or when not pregnant or for other reasons without a natural period. So there was nothing wrong with being ritually impure. It just meant it had to be managed. Like most other things in life, it's just a matter of how you handle ritual impurity, not about, avoiding it at all costs. So the question here is, we've got this jar that has, that's squeaky, the ash of the red cow. And we keep that because red cows are not common. And then we mix it with the water when we need it, and then we sprinkle it on people when they need to be purified. Now, according to the book of Bamidbar in the Torah, where we talk about this in Numbers, it says that this ash needs to be kept in a clean place. On the other hand, we also know that, according to other things we've discussed, that if you have a nice closed jar, that even if something unclean hits the outside, the stuff inside is still fine. So we have two competing issues here of whether or not this follows the jar rules, which is touching from the outside doesn't hurt the inside, or whether we're following an interpretation of the book of Numbers, which is put this in a clean place, which means it has to be completely clean. Not just the area is not ritually defiled, but there can't be anything unclean there, like, for example, a creepy crawly. We'll give it some legs. Right? So if I'm taking it out and I go and I crush something that is a creepy crawly, a sheretz, and it is ritually unclean, what's the status of the ash inside?
So what, is there any specific material that law work for the jar? Like the jar must be in a specific material, or no matter what material the jar always can keep?
If I remember correctly, it's fine, no matter what the material is, unless we're talking about things that have been heated. Once heat is involved, all bets are off and change. But if I remember correctly, bleed net air on this one, it doesn't really matter for the outside contamination. The inside absolutely absorbs depending upon the material, but the outside is not an issue. Right. So the question is, what happens if I crush this bug with the jar? Which, by the way, just if this is an issue, then you just went through the whole ritual of preparing this ash, and then you put it down and you crush a scorpion. Come on. But that's what the argument is. So Rabbi Joshua and Rabbi Yakim, man of Hadar, which I just love those titles, they both say that if you do that, you're out of luck. Right? Because it has to be put in a clean place according to the text of the Torah, and that supersedes the issue of the contact of the jar. On the other hand, Rabbi Eliezer says it's no problem, right? Because the jar rule trumps the clean place rule. Make sense of the two positions? Okay. On a different topic,
Although I think
it goes according to the majority,
there's a Monty
which is that
Python
it has to be in a clean place.
Must be.
Yeah.
I think there's a Monty Python sketch in
I mean,
Anyway,
yeah.
Rabbi Papias testified concerning one who had vowed 2 Nazarayships, that if he cut his hair after the first one on the 30th day, he cut his hair after the second one on the 60th day.
Go ahead and do.
And if he cut his hair on the 59th day, he has also fulfilled his duty, but the 30th day counts towards the required.
Okay. Timeline. But a pretty simple one. So the minimum duration for a vow of Nazirut, of being a Nazarite, where no wine and not cutting your hair and all of that.
Oh, seems.
Samson was a permanent Nazir, but most other people were temporary. Most other people had only a 30 day, or you could do it a bit longer, which is sort of what we're talking about here. So the usual is 30 days. Right? So this is day 1, and that's day 30. The question here is if I have a second day, a second vow, I vow it for two vows, right? I vow that I'll be a Nazir for whatever, 60 days or something like that. Then when do I do it? Now, the natural one, which he points out here, is that my first vow finishes, and so I cut. And then my second vow finishes, and I cut. Makes sense, right? Because 1 to 30, 30 to 60, 30 days, 30 days.
Must be any difference between this time period between one and the other.
You
Can
mean
you cut in one day and immediately you start, or you need to have a separation of?
so now we're into part 2. Right? So part 2, where he says if he cuts his hair on the 59th day, he's also fulfilled his duty. That's where he's saying it. So right now we're looking at 1 to 30, right? And technically 31 to 60, right? That's what it looks like at the moment, right? 1 to 30, 1 to 30. But what he's arguing is that, I'll switch one more time, is that this day, if you cut, we're going to make it like a timeline this way, right? That's 9 a.m. and this is 9 p.m. Right? If you cut and then you continue, that's okay, right? Because cutting it in the morning, the part is equal to the whole, right? So even though I'm cutting my hair in the morning and I didn't finish out my 30 days, part of the day counts as the whole. And that's a general rabbinic principle. This is why, for example, on the 7th day of Shiva, on the morning of the 7th day, Shiva is officially over. You don't have to wait until the end of that 7th day. So if you cut in the morning, that's fine. And if you begin your new vow at the end of that day or the middle of that day, the part of that day counts as the whole, which is why Shiva begins counting from the day with the burial. You don't have to wait until the first full day. That first partial day of the burial is the first day of Shiva. So if you bury somebody, you start counting 1 when you get done with the funeral. Even if there's it's the afternoon, and even if there's only another 3 hours worth of that day before sundown, that still counts as day 1.
That's how they calculate the jail time too.
How they calculate what?
Jail time.
The first day that you go to jail, no matter how long it is, how much left of that day.
If you get the rest at 11 o'clock or 11:30 at night, it counts as a day. If you get the rest after 12, it doesn't.
Okay, so it's a similar principle. They have a different timeline. We work off sundown and stars coming out, but the principle is very similar. And so the question is here, if I started on day 30, then technically on day 59, I could also cut my hair because it would be a complete, but not by hours, but it would be a complete count of 30. Make sense? Try to use this loophole with your teacher sometime.
Can you do the same with the Brit Milah?
Yeah, but the day the baby's born does count as one of the days, yes. And that's why also we do the Brit Milah as early as we can on the 8th day, because we don't delay the performance of that mitzvah. which is why it usually goes along with shacharit. But yes, the Brit Milah follows that same pattern, but we don't need to do another one 8 days later. And then on the 15th day, you do it again.
Is there any ceremony or any living period that you don't count, like doesn't work? Is there any exception from that rule?
The counting of like 24-hour days
Yeah.
as
You count
halakha.
25 hours for the people.
But we don't actually count 25 hours, right?
It's from sun to sun. It's a complete day.
Exactly. Well, but that's because it's the fullness of the day. It's not a question of counting. It's a question of, because people didn't have watches. They just watched and they said, okay, it's almost the beginning of Yom Kippur, so let's begin. And then they waited for the 3 stars to come out and they said, all right, it's definitely done. Let's do Havdalah. They weren't counting hours. They were just saying the whole day just happened. I'm trying to think of any multiple day activity where they counted full days only. I can't come up with any examples off the top of my head. Because the general rule is a part of the day counts as the full day. It's interesting. Okay, it's a good trivia question to see whether there's any chance.
No, the Omer wouldn't count for anything because that was just a brief prayer that he said.
Yeah, I mean, it's and you don't have to wait like 24 hours from the last time I said the Omer. You don't have to actually count it like that. As long as you're in the day, usually as early as possible, which means Mariv, you're fine. But you don't have to wait until the precise time you counted yesterday. So, okay, interesting question. Yes, we can do 7-6. I think we can squeeze it in. Aaron, I think we're back to you, right? Is it your turn or right? Yeah, I think. Yeah. Mishnah 6.
Rabbi Joshua and Rabbi Papias testified concerning the offspring of a peace offering, that it can be brought as a peace offering, whereas Rabbi Eliezer says that the offspring of a peace offering cannot be brought as a peace offering.
Go ahead and read the part 2.
But the sages say it can be brought.
Okay. So, I want to talk about a loophole. So, you want to bring a peace offering to the temple. So, you've got a cow, and you say, I dedicate this cow as a peace offering. And the cow is pregnant. Can the baby of that cow also count as a peace offering?
Can the baby of the cow count at the first born?
Well, let's not add firstborn in. Let's deal one issue at a time.
Because it's 2 in place of 1, maybe you can already use it.
Let's deal with one issue at a time.
Okay.
So just a straight question of, can you bring the baby as a peace offering? Yes?
Well, I don't think you should kill a pregnant cow because that'd be a waste of perfectly good 2 cows.
Okay.
It's okay if you kill. I would kill the mother rather than the baby because the baby has a lot more years to fulfill, and the mother,
But what if you want to bring peace offerings, because peace offerings are really the only time you can have a good reason for eating the meat. Because generally speaking, we didn't kill our animals except for holidays or offerings.
We were vegetarians.
Not by choice, but by poverty. Meat was, imagine eating your car.
That's
Right? You wouldn't choose to eat your car constantly because you need your car. So why would you choose to eat your cow constantly or your chicken constantly or any of your other animals?
I would eat the animals once the cow stops producing milk.
Exactly. Like the old joke, if a Jew is eating a chicken, one is sick. Right? Either the chicken's getting close to the end of his days or the Jew needs some meat because otherwise he's going to starve to death. Right? So we didn't, if you have a sheep, you can get wool off that sheep or you can eat it. If I get wool off the sheep, I'll get more wool next year. If I eat the sheep, I'll never get anything from it again. So generally speaking, people avoided eating their animals. But the Shlemim offering was great because you would offer it and you get to eat it. But what if you had a little Shlemim factory? Right? What if you have a cow and it's not pregnant yet? And you just leave it with the bull to get pregnant and produce an offering. And then you take that one, and then it gets pregnant again, and you take that one, and it gets pregnant again, and you take that one, right? Neat little loophole. You can create your own little baby factory that will constantly be producing animals that you can then have ready to go for the offering. There's only one problem. The mama cow is never making it to the altar. And that means you're delaying the bringing of an offering that you've made a vow on. And that's really what the argument is about, right? They basically agree that yes, the offspring, if born, could be brought, but you shouldn't make
instead of the mom.
No, in addition.
In addition.
Right. But you shouldn't do that because then you'll be inclined to deliberately delay bringing the mother because you'll want to have the offspring and maybe even more than once. And that means you're now being negligent on bringing your vow to the temple. It's the same way that if someone says, I vow to give $5,000 to the temple, please. Can I leave that in a bank account earning interest to be able to donate more than $5,000 and just keep donating the interest, but never actually donate the 5,000 or delay donating the 5,000? Now, yes, in general, we do allow that, by the way, and that's called legacy gifting, and you can have annuities and all of that, and we are more than happy to help talk to you about how to arrange a long-term giving plan that will help ensure the future of Temple Israel and magnify your gift. However, if the congregation needs it immediately, like for a leaky roof or something, then it is better not to say, I'll give $5,000 and then show up 20 years later with the interest of the $5,000. And that's kind of a modern example. But taking the sacrifices were obviously much more serious, and therefore the delay issue was much more serious for them as well.
What happens if you delayed it, like what you said, and during the delay the cow dies?
Well, that's also another issue. Not only if it dies, but also if it is blemished, right? If it gets a blemish somewhere on its body, then it's no longer fit for the sacrifices either. So that was another worry and concern, which is why. Well, but even still, it's better not to put yourself in that position unnecessarily, which is why the sages say, don't do this. However, we're going to get a little reality check. Part 3.
Rabbi Papias said, I testify that we had a cow which was a peace offering, and we ate it at Passover, and its offspring we ate as a peace offering at the next festival.
Okay. So they say no, that doesn't work, right? That it can work, but that doesn't mean that it should work, right? That it is the kind of thing that is supposed to be brought. However, notice the order that he's bringing them in, right? The mother came first. So it was not that we did the offspring and then the mother later. The order in which they were born was the order in which they were offered. So there was no unnecessary delay in this case. At least that seems to be the implication. Good? Okay. We'll finish there with 7:6, and we'll pick up at 7:7, not next week, sorry, good mental reminder. Next week is Purim, and we've got some celebrating to do. 7:7 will be in 2 weeks.